Get started here. Hello, everyone. My name is Amy Wolf. I'm the programming coordinator for the Osterville Village Library. Thank you so much for being with us today, and to our friends joining us on Zoom, thank you so much for being here as well. I have a little opening that I'm going to give. Referred to as the Balzac of Boston history by the Boston Globe, Anthony Sammarco is a noted historian and author of over 70 books, actually it's 89, on the history and development of Boston, and he lectures widely on the history of his native city. His books, Lost Boston, The History of Howard Johnson's How a Massachusetts Soda Fountain Became a Roadside Icon, and The Baker Chocolate Company, A Sweet History, have been bestsellers, and he lectures widely on popular history as well as on Christmas traditions in Boston. We are excited to have with us world-famous historian, author, and lecturer, and not to mention new trustee to the Osterville Village Library, Anthony Sammarco.
It's a pleasure to be here. I thank you for that introduction. I'm still me, and I don't think anybody on my lane actually knows who I am in Osterville. But the idea is that when I write basically to not only utilize my skill and memory, but also to utilize it in my courses at Boston University. I've been teaching at the Metropolitan College for the last 10 years, the Urban College of Boston previously for 20 years. But I had a career in finance, and finance was important because it basically paid the bills. But I've always had a fascination with how Boston and the neighborhoods would actually evolve and change, not only from the 17th century, but even today in the 21st century. Pavilion, which is the publisher of Lost Boston, is located in London. They had contacted me a few years ago, inquiring if I would be interested in doing a book in their Lost City series. And I thought in some ways, what is it? And it was a premise that basically these would show in a format that would actually be 165 pages, things that were actually lost by either demolition, fire, or change beyond recognition from the advent of photography to the present. And they were interested in doing this because they'd already done a few books on Lost New York, Lost Chicago, Lost Washington, D.C., and Lost Baltimore. So when they were telephoning me, they were editing at that point Lost Las Vegas. And if I thought if Las Vegas over the last 50 years had actually changed beyond recognition, Boston deserved a book. Well, Boston, settled in 1630 by Puritans seeking religious freedom, would see a homogeneous town for 2 centuries. But in the 19th century, because of matriculation and immigration, Boston would change drastically. By 1870, with a population of only 250,000, of which one half were either immigrants or the children of immigrants, we began to see Boston needing new land. They filled in the South End, they filled in the Back Bay, and they also began to annex formerly independent cities and towns. In 1868, the city of Roxbury was annexed to Boston. In 1870, the town of Dorchester. In 1874, the city of Charlestown, the town of Brighton, which included Allston, as well as the town of West Roxbury that included Roslindale, as well as Jamaica Plain. It wouldn't be until 1912 that the town of Hyde Park was annexed, and that would be the last of the communities. At that point, Boston had a population of over 750,000 people and 1.5 million throughout the metropolitan area. So Boston was changing, not only topographically, architecturally, as well as, of course, ethnically, religious, and racially. And Lost Boston, I hope, would actually chronicle these things. Well, the photographs primarily come from the Boston Public Library. They're albumum photographs, which is really some of the best photographs one would find of any city or town. And in some ways, they do go the gamut from 1850 to 2010. Seen on the cover is Union Station. Now, Union Station was a major terminus in Boston. It allowed all of the trains going north or northwest to be under one terminal. It was built on Causeway Street. During that period, the land was infill when Pemberton Hill, one of the three hills of Boston, was demolished, and it was used for the infill. The building was designed by Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge, one of the foremost architects in Boston in the 19th century, and in some ways was the pride of Boston. But it was torn down in 1927 to make way for the Boston Garden and North Station. So we would see in some ways some of these architecturally impressive buildings would only survive 30, 40, 50 years before they were demolished. Well, in this book, I was instructed to fill out 150 forms that not only had photographs, but also a small introduction. And my publishers would choose 68. They weren't all my favorites, but the first part of this lecture will show you some of my very favorites. Boston during that period not only had prints and etchings, but later photographs after 1850. But I thought this was impressive because it was the Old Feather Store. This was originally the home of Thomas Staniford, for whom Staniford Street is named in Boston. It was something that was called the Old Cocked Hat because it had dormers projecting from every side of the building. Residential right through to the 1820s, it later became the Old Feather Store. And we might think of feathers as something that might be a decoration, but these feathers were used for bolsters, pillows, and mattresses. And by 1850, it was Charles Lovejoy's clothing store. You can see on the right, Faneuil Hall, and in the distance, Quincy Market. So you get an idea that it was within a very busy area. But on the left was North Street. And of course, North Street was just a lane. They wanted to enlarge it, and the building was demolished in 1860. So not only was it antiquarian, but it was something in some ways that was a contributing factor to 17th century architecture. So the demolition of some of these buildings was impressive because they were so important. This is the Massachusetts State Prison at Charlestown. This is a building designed by Gridley J. Fox Bryant and built of granite, a quarrying technique invented by his father, Gridley Bryant, to provide granite for the Bunker Hill Monument. Well, this was a state-of-the-art prison. It had a central octagonal rotunda and wings that actually had individual cells for the male prisoners. Throughout the 19th century, this was located on Prison Point. Maybe you've heard on WBZ radio in the morning that the backup of traffic on Prison Point Bridge was incredible. I've always wondered, does anybody wonder what Prison Point Bridge really meant? Well, the whole idea was it continued, and in the 20th century, it had the first electric chair, which ironically was used for Sacco and Vanzetti. And later, by the 1850s, it was thought antiquated. The prisoners was actually sent to both Walpole State Prison and Concord State Prison, and the prison was demolished. The land lay fallow until Bunker Hill Community College would build on its site. We realized also that some of the buildings that would be constructed were the most impressive and largest in all of New England. And this is the United States Post Office and Sub-Treasury that was located at Post Office Square. The building was designed by Alfred Mullet. He was a federal architect who would actually design 18 sub-treasuries and post offices throughout the United States. And in this instance, with two junior architects, Gridley J. Fox Bryant and Alexander Este, this was modeled on a Second French Empire, normally from the Parisian capital. And it was in the process of being built in 1872 when the Great Boston Fire occurred. Because the building was being constructed of Barry, Vermont granite, it was impervious to fire, unlike Chelmsford and Quincy that imploded. This building would eventually be completed in 1878. But it wasn't just architecturally significant. If you look at the center, at the top, there are two piers with sculptures at the top. On the tops of these two towers flanking the center roof were 17-foot-high white marble statues by Daniel Chester French. On the left was labor, supporting domestic life and sustaining the fine arts. And on the right was science, which was controlling the newfangled electricity and steam. The building, which actually had even the United States Courthouse located here, would also be demolished in 1929 to make way for what is today the John McCormick Art Deco Federal Post Office. There was also the Cyclorama. And if you are in Boston, maybe you've been there for not only antique shows, lectures, dances. but it was a major part of Boston after the Civil War. This was designed by Cummings and Sears, a very well-known architectural firm, and built in 1884 to display a 400-foot-long cyclorama by Paul Philippot of the Battle of Gettysburg, and you can see that at the base. Now, a cyclorama is something that goes around the interior of the walls, and it's a graphic illustration, but this was painted on oil. The building, as you can see, looked like a fortress, crenellated towers, and the entrance with this battlement. It was incredible. And for 25 cents, you could actually go in and see with beautiful lighting, and of course, not only broken picket fences, mannequins in Union outfits, as well as Confederate uniforms. It was something that was really quite moving. But as it never changed, after the second time, it became boring, and it eventually closed in 1890. At that point, it was rented to a mechanic who would actually begin to repair automobiles. His name was Alfred Champion, and he invented the Champion spark plug in this building. Now, I'm so old that when I was a child, this was the wholesale flower exchange. And we would walk by, and the aroma of not only flowers, but every sort of greenery wafting from this building was incredible. But by the 1970s, it was repurposed as a center of the arts. And today we can not only see plays, but we can also see live dramatic things that are done. It survived, but it's completely changed of any recognition of its original building. You might remember Jordan Marsh and Company was New England's largest department store, founded in 1851 by Ebediah Jordan and Benjamin Lloyd Marsh. Jordan Marsh had moved since 1851 4 times, and eventually they bought the building on the left, which was the old Warren dry goods store. They hired Nathaniel Bradley to actually increase this. Bradley, who was a very well-known architect, and created the prototype of what is the South End row house. Swell bay facade, red brick, townhouses sharing uniformity of height, setback, and building material, that Bradley, by 1870, was specializing on commercial architecture. Jordan Marsh, during that period, had 224 departments under one roof. Men's clothing, women's clothing, children's clothing, not only household goods, carpets, rugs, furs, and even trunks. But the period of the 20th century would see that their blueberry muffins were among the best. It closed in 1996, and of course it was absorbed into Macy's. This building was demolished during the bicentennial. There was also the Boston Opera House, designed by Wheelwright and Haven and built in 1909 on Huntington Avenue, just west of Symphony Hall. Now, Huntington Avenue, which was actually a major avenue of the arts, had Horticultural Hall, Symphony Hall, and the Opera House. And in this instance, it was actually built and financed by Ebediah Jordan Jr. of Jordan Marsh to the tune of $16 million. And it was something that would actually guarantee support through his largesse, that was actually something that would match the subscribers who would actually subscribe to the opera. Well, this was something that was grand, and many people in Boston felt that finally grand opera would be something that would be available to everyone in Boston. And seen on the right was Madame Nordica. Lillian Nordica grew up in Dorchester and became a widely known opera singer. And she sung, as we see here, as Brunhild in Wagner's Der Liebesnedeligung. And this was something that was really important because this building, after Jordan's death in 1916, was no longer funded by the family. It became a place for not only car shows, flower shows, we would see even movies being shown here. But by 1957, Northeastern University bought it, demolished it, and used it as a parking lot. Later, it became Spear Hall, a dormitory at Northeastern. There was Sullivan Station on the elevated railway. Because I had family that lived in Charlestown, as a child, I would ride this with my parents and, of course, be mesmerized that this was an elevated railway above the streets. Well, in 1899, Henry Whitney, who was president of the West End Street Railway Company, wanted to see Boston have something that could run on a timetable. Boston had pedestrians, they had streetcars, they had horse-drawn wagons and horse-drawn carriages. It was sometimes easy to walk to where you were going to take transportation. And by building an elevated railway, it could run from 5 a.m. until 1 a.m. without interference. This was something that was designed by Ernest Wadsworth Longfellow, a well-known architect and nephew of the great poet and author. The building, as you see here, was in Charlestown at Sullivan Square, named for Governor of Massachusetts. But the elevated railway would connect Charlestown to Roxbury at Dudley Street and eventually to Forest Hills and Jamaica Plain. And in that instance, throughout the 20th century, this was a major means of access to Boston, not only for business, but for pleasure in the evening. And many people realized that when the elevated closed in 1987 and was replaced by the Silver Line buses, a little bit of Boston's history went with it. Transportation also included penny ferries. And right through from 1833 to about 1946, penny ferries connected Boston to Maverick Square in East Boston. During the period of the 1830s, when William Sumner, for whom the Sumner Tunnel is named, began to develop what he called Noddle's Island into a new neighborhood called East Boston, it would be both residential as well as commercial. The idea was the very first ferry was the Tom Thumb ferry, and it was tiny. No more than 50 people could fit on it. But by the period of the 1920s, there were 5 ferries, and this was the Ashburnham. And for a penny, you could cross Boston Harbor and then come to Maverick Square. But it doesn't look like these people were just going home. What happened was that during the period of the 1890s, they developed a new railroad called the Narrow Gauge, and it connected Maverick Square in East Boston with Lynn. Lynn was a major employer, especially for people working in the shoe industry, but it also had a stop at Revere Beach. And Revere Beach was promoted as the first public bathing beach in America. These people are pretty well dressed for going to the beach. It doesn't look like Dowson's Beach to me. But in this instance, they came and they would alight onto the train and then go off to Revere Beach, where it was basically not only games, rides, as well as walking along the promenade. But transportation in East Boston would also include the East Boston Airport. Originally just a cinder landing strip, by 1927, it was opened officially as the East Boston Airport. And in the distance is the administration building with a biplane surmounting the roof. This biplane could connect Boston to New York in 6 hours. It was incredible. But that whole aspect of transportation was major. And during the 1920s and 1930s, as they began to supplant trains connecting Boston and New York, the airport increased in size and scale. Later, it became an international airport and was named Logan International Airport. I'll give somebody a free book if they can tell me what Logan did for a living. He was the presiding judge of the South Boston District Court. Does that sound like somebody we'd name an international airport after? I always thought that he must have had great political connections. But there is a statue of Logan outside of Logan Airport. We all see it as the buses whip by. But Logan Airport has today become something, a major part of the transportation industry in all of New England. Each of these things have represented in some ways different things that are now lost. But we have to realize that Boston in the early part of the 19th century was a changing place. This is a painting of State Street from 1801. It's in the collection of the Massachusetts Historical Society. It shows the old State House at the head of State Street. This was the seat of provincial government in the 18th century and would later become Boston's City Hall in 1822 when the city embraced a municipal government. It divided the city by the south end on the left and the north end on the right. And as you can see, it was primarily residential with a few shops. Boston in 1801 had a population of about 17,000 people. But in this instance, it was a town built of wood that would be transformed into a city built of red brick by Charles Bulfinch. Bulfinch, and this is a painting by Mather Brown, was somebody who was graduated from Harvard College in 1786. He took the grand tour of Europe for 3 years. And when he returned to Boston as a gentleman's architect, he was never trained in architecture, began to transform Boston into what became a major city. His form of architecture would be called neoclassical or federal architecture, which meant symmetry. And one of his first commissions in 1795 was the Tontine Crescent. It ran between Washington Street and Federal Street, and it had a very gentle elliptical curve. He modeled it on the Bath Crescent in Bath, England, and this was built of red brick but painted gray to emulate the Portland stone used in Bath. It shared a uniformity, 3 stories high, setback, building material, and design, and it faced a park, much like London had had in that period. In that way, Bulfinch himself had introduced a new form of architecture. And not only was this an elegant and costly place, it was the first connected row houses in all of New England. On the right-hand side was Bulfinch's drawing of what he wanted to build. It's in the collection of the Boston Athenaeum. And on the left, you can actually see how it was finally completed. So if you divide that down and open it up, you'll see that everything is symmetrical. The 2 windows in the attic, the 2 pilasters and 2 columns, and of course, even the small doorways on either side of the large arched entrance. Well, this building, the epitome of sophisticated design, was the most expensive place in Boston. It only survived until 1858 when it was demolished to make way for a commercial structure. But that archway, which led through to Summer Street, would later be called Arch Street. And we realize in that instance that this beautiful building, which no longer survives, still survives by the name of the street. In a lot of ways, Bulfinch was really Boston's premier architect. He not only designed on the left-hand side the Federal Street Church, and I want you to kind of remember that name, which was a Unitarian church built in 1809, but in the foreground, the first Roman Catholic church in Boston. This was the Church of the Holy Cross. Not only did Bulfinch design this, but he designed 19 places of worship in Boston, 18 Protestant and 1 Roman Catholic. But it was at the edge of the Tontine Crescent, the most expensive place to live in Boston. And in this instance, from a small church, it would later in 1828 be elevated to a cathedral. And seen on the right-hand side, the presiding bishop would actually see to this as the congregation increased through immigration, initially French and later Irish. We would see in 1858 the land sold and the church would move to Boston South End. This whole area, you began to realize, which was once residential, began to give way in some ways to commercial by the 1850s and 1860s. But Bulfinch wasn't just an architect, he was also a land developer. And of course, Beacon Hill, which was one of the 3 hills of Boston, Mount Vernon, Beacon Hill, and Pemberton Hill, and Boston was known as the Tri-Mount, would be something that would be increased in such a way that the hills would be cut down and we would see them used to infill the flat of Beacon Hill for what is the flat of Beacon Hill at River Street, as well as on the other side, the area where Quincy Market is. But the man who owned most of this land was John Hancock, the great patriot. And the Hancock House, built in 1737 of Quincy granite, was built by his uncle, Thomas Hancock, and was one of the grandest houses, not just in Boston, but most of Massachusetts. In the area of the 1790s to early 1800, his heirs sold off the land. And we began to see residential development in the early part of the 19th century. This is Beacon Street, looking towards Somerset Street. On the left would be the State House. And in the foreground, on the right, is the Amory Tickner House, designed by Charles Bulfinch and built in 1804. It was at the corner of Beacon and Park Street, but it was called Amory's Folly. Amory was a very wealthy merchant, but when the building was completed, he went bankrupt. It was 24 rooms, and he only had 2 children. In that instance, he subdivided it into two duplexes, and the Tickner family, who owned Tickner and Fox, a well-known publishing company, bought it. In this instance, these buildings would be built on Park Street, Tremont Street, Boylston Street, and even Beacon Street. And of course, with wonderful park views, in this instance, the Boston Common, they commanded high prices. So Bulfinch had really begun to transform the city. He left in 1819 to complete the Capitol in Washington, D.C. But in the 1830s, his successor was Asher Benjamin, again, another well-known architect who was really a builder. And Pemberton Square, which was one of the three hills of Boston, would be cut down. On the lower left-hand side, you can see a wonderful watercolor painting that actually was on a fire engine in the 1820s. And this is the Tri-Mount. The center is Beacon Hill, the left is Mount Vernon, on the right, Pemberton Hill. And as you see here, this is what Pemberton Square became. Well, Gardner Green, a well-known Boston man, died in 1832, and his estate and the other that made up the Hill property was bought by Patrick Tracy Jackson. Jackson then hired Wilmington's teamster, Asa Sheldon, to level the hill. And starting in May of 1835, Sheldon used 126 oxen and 250 men to remove 65 feet of elevation off the top of the hill. And of the work crew, 60 were Yankees and 190 were Irishmen, with most of the Yankees being teamsters driving wagons and all of the Irish manning shovels. But what they did was to remove the hill, and they created a square that emulated Lewisburg Square. And this was not only contiguous, but it also had that gentle elliptical arc. This was the home of many China trade families, the Perkinses, the Forbes, the Cushings. And Pemberton Square was described as dwellings built in the fine, indeed elegant of their time, and for many years was the residence of the most substantial citizens. Jackson was a marketer, and in 1835 he sponsored a design competition for developing his property. And Alexander Wadsworth, a surveyor, won first prize, and the area was known initially as Phillips Square in honor of John Phillips, the first mayor of Boston. The following year, Jackson commissioned George Minor Dexter to design the houses for Pemberton Square, as well as the cast iron fence for the front yards and fence with lampposts for the central garden. In this way, not only did it emulate Lewisburg Square, but it also emulated the Tontine Crescent. And in that way, Boston continued to see much of its development in a very refined manner. But one area that would eventually become quite interesting was Scollay Square. And in the very center is the Scollay Building, which was the home of William Scollay, a man who immigrated from Scotland. He was the man that not only departed stagecoaches, but greeted them upon their arrival in Boston. And though this was S.D. Bates Painting Company, and this is a photograph of about 1860, the building had been used by the Boston Athenaeum, 1807 to 1809, and the area was a transportation center. In 1838, the area was officially called Scollay Square by the city, and in 1856, horse-drawn streetcars replaced omnibuses, which were horse-drawn buses. On the far right, you can see S.S. Pearson Company, opened in 1831 in the Old West End. But this area, in some ways, would also include Tremont Street. Now, this is directly opposite the Granary Burying Ground. Now, you have to remember, Tremont is a corruption of the word Tri-Mount, or three hills. So it's Tremont. But in this instance, it was something developed in the 19th century as probably one of the most sophisticated streetscapes in the city. In the foreground is Gleason's Publishing Hall. This was started by a man named Frederick Gleason. You can see on the right-hand side his etching. He had Gleason's Pictorial Drawing Room Companion, the first illustrated newspaper in Boston. He published it from 1839 until 1856. The building, which actually had these enormous, monumental Corinthian columns, which were dressed in East Milton Square and brought to town by oxen carts, were things that created a very sophisticated Greek Revival design. To the left was Tremont Temple, the first integrated place of worship in Boston. And further down, you can see the portico of King's Chapel, initially an Anglican church, and after the Revolution, the first Unitarian church in the United States. So Tremont Street didn't just have these major buildings, it also had Horticultural Hall. When this building was completed, and this was done in 1851, the Massachusetts Horticultural Society had been founded in 1829. It was all men except for one woman, a woman by the name of Lillian Westcott Huntington. She lived on Canton Avenue in Milton. Each of these people were people that had gardens, but they had gardeners as well. And what they did was to hybridize fruits, vegetables, and flowers. So one might have had a Bartlett pear in 1829. But by doing what the bees do, which was to cross-pollinate the pollen between different types of pears, you now began to create Bear d'Anjou, we call it Anjou pear today, Bosque, Clapp's favorite, and many others. And during the growing season on the third floor, they would actually display their fruits and vegetables and flowers for awards. Gold medals, silver medals, bronze medals, and it became a major part of Boston's social life. They remained here until 1899 when they moved to the corner of Huntington Avenue and Massachusetts Avenue opposite Symphony Hall. And of course, Boston was changing. As I said, in the 1850s, an area which was once residential, such as Summer Street, had given way to commercial growth. But Trinity Church, which is the second oldest place of Episcopal worship in Boston, was designed by George Bremer and built in 1829 at the corner of Summer and Hawley Streets. And it was so admired that it was called the Bower of Taste, which was when it was built. And the Gothic Revival Church, with its crenellated tower, was somewhat cumbersome, and with its rough-hewn granite blocks was described as a massive temple of rough-hewn granite and ponderous square-front tower. Give you an example, this was on the site of Filene's. So you see in that instance, by what was once residential, by the time of the Civil War, was 90% commercial. And Boston in that area would change tremendously. Seen here is an overhead view of Boston from a photograph. And it's something we realize. It says, as the eagle and wild goose see it, was a detail of a photograph taken by James Wallace Black in 1860 from Samuel King's hot air balloon called The Queen of the Air. In 1863, Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote in the Atlantic Monthly, Boston, as the eagle and wild goose see it, is a very different object from the same place as the solid citizen looks up at its eaves and chimneys. And the Old South and Trinity Church are two landmarks not to be mistaken. If you look on the midpoint on the left, you'll see a spire, and that's the Old South Meeting House. Follow it down 45 degrees, and on the lower right-hand side, you see the crenellated tower of Trinity Church. So between an 18th century place of worship and an early 19th century place of worship, everything behind it would be destroyed in 1872. And it was by the Great Boston Fire. The Great Boston Fire started from a spark that ignited a bale of cotton at a hoop skirt factory on Summer Street. By the period of midnight of November 9th of 1872, over 70 acres of Boston was being destroyed by fire. Currier and Ives dramatically depicted the Great Boston Fire as seen from Boston Harbor, with excursion boats, ferries, sailboats, and rowboats filled with spectators watching the cataclysmic fire that would eventually destroy 65 acres of downtown Boston. It was said that the church steeples, and especially the dome of the State House, stood out in brilliant magnificence, while every street was centered upon the vast conflagration and was radiant with the light of the great fire. By midnight, people would pay $1 to go onto these excursion boats to actually watch Boston burn. Well, Boston did see in some ways what would be equivalent to the World War II devastation in Europe. Russell Conwell, who wrote a book on the Great Boston Fire, said, the vista from the vicinity of Summer Street was grandiose and disheartening. Flames flickered up from time to time from the mass of broken, seared, disjointed masonry, played around the cracked and dismantled bases of the great carved iron pillars, and sometimes burst out vehemently from the interstices of the debris. And great columns of smoke rose majestically into the clear air, and then formed into party-colored clouds, which cast dull shadows over the scene. In the distant center, you can see the spire of Old South Meeting House, and on the left, the dome of Boston City Hall. Well, Boston did see tremendous devastation, 775 buildings, and the equivalent today of $18 billion worth of destruction. But seen here are the ruins of Trinity Church. And as I say in my book on the fire, it was almost picturesque with the crenellated tower holding forth on Summer Street, with its windows and doors blown open to allow glimpses into the once sacred space. A group of men stand amongst the debris that covers the sidewalk and street, and the Reverend Jonathan Beckley of the Summer Street Baptist Church in Boston said, "Dear old Trinity Church, many tender memories cluster around its smoldering ruins, and its lonely tower brings mingled scenes of joy and sorrow to many minds, which the granite only symbolized, remains a continue elsewhere, the Christian work which for so long a period has centered within the massive walls that crumbled before the flames." Well, the building was demolished, and of course, Filene's was built on its site, and the basement became Filene's basement. But Boston in that period, as I mentioned, its population was increasing, and it wasn't just by matriculation, but primarily through immigration. Seen here in 1852, looking west from the dome of the Massachusetts State House, we see Beacon Hill in the foreground, but in the distance, we see the Back Bay. And the Back Bay was literally a bay of water, but it was marshland. In 1824, the Mill Dam was built, and you can see it in the very center. It connected Beacon Hill to Sewell's Point, or what we call Kenmore Square today, and it dammed the Charles River, seen on the right-hand side. By damming the river, the marshes began to stagnate. There was no longer a tidal flow twice daily. Throughout the 1830s and 1840s, it became a noxious effluvia, which meant that it stunk. And in that instance, standing water breeds mosquitoes, and mosquitoes can bring all sorts of diseases. And we realized that Boston declared this a health hazard. And though they started on the south end, the Back Bay, which began in 1859, thanks to John Souther, a major South Boston engineer who created the Souther steam shovel, would begin to infill this with a railroad connected between the Back Bay and Needham. And they dredged the hills of Needham, bringing the soil on gondola cars 24 hours a day, 6 days a week for 30 years. And of course, seen here, what they had actually tried to emulate was the filling of the public garden. Now, we've probably all been to the public garden. We've all rode the swan boats. It's beautiful and it's well kept, thanks to the friends of the public garden. But this was infilled. Throughout the 1830s, Josiah Quincy, then mayor of Boston, decided that street sweepings would be thrown into this area, which was part of the Back Bay marshes. And in 1837, it was solid enough to open the public garden. The public garden had not only a serpentine body of water, it had the smallest suspension bridge in the world. It also had greenhouses where many of the flowers would be hybridized as well as grown over the winter to plant. So seen in the distance, you began to see the new Back Bay. Back Bay was built on man-made land, and it shared a regulation. It wasn't zoned, but you would see that no building would exceed 4 stories in height. And when it was completed, you began to see some of these new buildings, such as the Arlington Street Church, designed by Arthur Gilman, built at the corner of Boylston and Arlington Street. Now, this congregation was the old Federal Street Church on Federal Street in downtown Boston. As the neighborhood became more commercial, families moved to the new Back Bay, and the churches followed them. And you can see here that Boylston Street was residential, right through to 1883 when it began to actually see shops. But Arlington Street was the epitome of the new Boston. Back Bay was totally man-made. Not only the infilling of the land by soil from Needham as well as staves or pilings brought in from Tonawanda, New York, they would support these individual row houses. And in this instance, as you can see, 4 stories in height, and they were the same design along Arlington Street. These all date between 1859 and 1865. They faced the public garden. These were the most expensive houses to be built at that time. But you can see with the wide expanse of Arlington Street, with no cars, such a boom, you began to see that it emulated the Parisian boulevards. Boston was like Old England, but the Back Bay was the sophisticated European capital that everybody wanted to visit. And seen by 1875, the Commonwealth Avenue Mall in the foreground, at Dartmouth Street, much of the land had actually been filled in. It took over 30 years, and we would see in that instance, it was the big dig of the 19th century. But the land, when it was actually to be completed, would be auctioned, and we could all bid on our lot of land if we wanted to build something. But once the land had been paid for, we had many men working on it, we would see that the proceeds, the net proceeds, would be distributed to 3 entities. The city of Roxbury, which actually owned right up to Dartmouth Street, the city of Boston, and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Well, the 2 municipalities used it for municipal improvements. But I have to commend the Commonwealth of Massachusetts used their third of the money to found the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and the founding of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So they invested in education and the next generations. The Back Bay was the epitome of not only elegance, but it has the best architectural panoply from 1860 to 1920. And in that instance, it wasn't just residential, it was also institutional. And seen here on Boylston Street, across from the Boylston Street burial ground, was the Boston Public Library. It was designed by Charles Kirby and was a brownstone Italianate design. It emulated the Boston Athenaeum on Beacon Hill. But as you can see in this photograph, it was within a residential neighborhood. The Boston Public Library was free to all. It didn't matter who you were, Bostonian or new immigrant. Newspapers, magazines, and of course books were all available to anyone. And in this instance, the building, though it looks austere on the exterior, had the most wonderful interior. Seen here is Bates Hall. And Joshua Bates, born in Weymouth, Massachusetts, became a principal in Baring Brothers in London and became a multi-millionaire in the 1860s. He would give $100,000, which today would be the equivalent of about $15 million on 3 different occasions. And in this instance, a 3-story reading room with enormous engaged Corinthian columns. And as you can see, tables as well as book stacks. It was something that was just incredible. The library remained here until they opened a new library at Copley Square. This building was demolished and the Colonial Theater was built on its site. But the Back Bay would also have the Young Men's Christian Association, or what we call the YMCA. This building was designed by Sturgis and Brigham and built in 1882 at the corner of Boylston and Berkeley Streets. The building was said to be of a Scottish baronial style. I would think it was more Dutch with these Dutch dormers, but it was something that was quite eclectic, and it was a place where young men were encouraged to pursue good health through exercise. In 1896, its popular lectures in the evening were organized into the Evening Institute of Young Men, which proved so popular that in 1898 law classes were added with business and engineering programs. Those classes led to the founding of Northeastern University through the YMCA. There was also the Natural History Museum. This was designed by William Gibbons Preston, the same architect who did the suspension bridge in the public garden. But this building was envisioned of one of 3. And this is between Boylston Street, Berkeley Street, Newbury Street, and Clarendon Street. Well, this building was completed in 1863, and the Natural History Museum was a place where you saw dinosaur eggs, whale skeletons hanging from the ceilings, all sorts of displays of different rocks, formations, and things of that sort. And it was really the first integrated club in Boston, integrated with the fact that they allowed women as well as men. And it survived right through to 1963. But as they'd outgrown the building, they moved to Cambridge and became known as the Science Museum. This then, you might remember your mother going to Bonwatella's. And then it became Louis, where I went when I had a 32-inch waist. And then Restoration Hardware, which is restored it today. But the building was something that was incredible. And seen here from the second to the third story and the roof rafters, they had taxidermists doing all sorts of things on natural history. And of course, I don't remember this, but this skeleton has always been something that's been ingrained in my mind. I can imagine what it must have been like to visit. But even the Science Museum in the 1960s was really quite fun. Well, adjacent to it was the second of the envisioned 3 buildings. And this was the first place of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The building was known as the Rogers Building, and it was designed on Apsley House, which was the home of the Duke of Wellington in London. And yes, it looks exactly like this. You began to realize that this, designed by Preston, was a magnificent place for a different form of education than one might get at Harvard. Rather than a classical education, this provided education in engineering, electricity, and the first school of architecture in the United States. William Roach Ware of Milton would actually serve as the dean of the architectural school for 2 generations. And though he was educated at Harvard and the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, what he did was to train generations of American architects, and it influenced the houses and institutions and places of worship that were built. It was named for William Barton Rogers, seen on the lower right-hand side, the first president of what was called MIT, or primarily Tech. Tech was something that was a feeder school, and you realize I finished at a place that's after Roxbury Latin at Boston Technical High School. I wanted to be an architect. And Technical High School, which was one had to pass a test to get into it, and you had to maintain grades, was the feeder school to MIT. I came to my senses and I went to accounting school. But seen here was Boylston Street, looking west from Berkeley Street, and it had the Rogers Building on the right. This was something that was not only built in 1864, but named for William Barton Rogers, the first president. And you realized in this instance that the classical 5-story pressed brick facade had a great tetrastyle Corinthian portico of 4 monumental stone columns that was based on the design of Apsley House. So Boylston Street became a grand street in Boston, and it led to Copley Square. And seen here in the 1930s, and this is actually from what was called the Hotel Kensington, which stood on Boylston Street. It was a residential hotel. It wasn't an apartment house. You would see Trinity Church. Well, Trinity had already bought land, even though the fire destroyed the church in 1872. This building was designed by Gambrell and Richardson. It was a very well-known architectural firm that had H.H. Richardson as the junior partner. Well, Richardson designed this with a tower that emulated the Tower of Salamanca in Spain. And it was something that created a totally different way to interpret church architecture. Now, this dates to the 1880s. Think back to 1820, and we had white painted meeting houses. Now we had places of worship that were brownstone, that also had Chelmsford granite, Dedham granite, even terracotta, and the interiors were decorated totally different than they might have been at one time. Well, Copley Square is something that really evolved from Art Square. It was known as Art Square because the Museum of Fine Arts was located at the corner of what is today St. James Avenue and Dartmouth Street. Boston, on July 4th of 1876, raised their bar because they've now had not only a museum, but they felt that they actually had the most important aspect. They had class. A museum such as this was something that could emulate the European masters. Designed by Sturgis and Brigham, it was only half the size as you see here, and there was no original art. It was all plaster castings and things that they were able to just have on loan from various families. But in 1876, this was something that showed how much Boston had grown. In 1883, Copley Square was renamed after John Singleton Copley. I've never understood it. He was a loyalist, a well-known artist, and left Boston during the Revolution. But Bostonians renamed Art Square Copley Square. Seen here from a painting by Enrico Meneghelli, this was done in 1879, you began to see these masters, most of which were on loan to the museum, now being displayed as you would have seen at the Boston Athenaeum prior to this, or even in London or Paris or Berlin. During that period, many people supported the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and we saw many people giving huge sums of money. Harvey Parker of the Parker House gave $100,000 in 1880. Today, the equivalent of about $12 million, and they bought Rembrandt etchings. And in 1896, Henry Pierce, the owner of the Baker Chocolate Company in Dorchester, gave $1 million. And the Pierce Fund still to this day actually acquires new art. So this was something that was the epitome of success. Originally, as I mentioned, they had plaster castings. And there was a man by the name of Pietro Paul Caproni. He was an Italian immigrant, but he was very skilled. And he was allowed by many museums in Europe to make plaster castings of originals. Give you an example, if you look on the lower right-hand side, it's the Dying Gaul. And of course, the wonderful frieze in the distance is from the Parthenon. So he was somebody who would sell these, not just to museums. I even have two in my bedroom. But the idea is it was a beautiful thing to see these classical pieces. If you couldn't afford the original, why not get a plaster casting? Seen here by the period of 1890, the area of Copley Square included an enlarged Museum of Fine Arts. Of course, on the right-hand side, S.S. Pierce and Company opened in 1887, and on the left-hand side, a residential hotel known as the Hotel Westminster. Designed by Henry Krieger and built in 1897, this was a residential apartment building. And when you think of apartments, you would think you basically would rent it, but people stayed here for ages. Would go the gamut from 6 rooms to 12 rooms. And this was the site of what is today the John Hancock Tower. When it was demolished, it was something you began to realize this whole neighborhood, which had been primarily residential and apartment buildings, had changed. But on the opposite side was S.S. Pierce and Company in Copley Square. This building would be the third of eventually 9 locations of the company. It was founded in 1831 by Samuel Stillman Pierce, who after he married his wife, began to pronounce his name as Purse. She was affected, as one might say. But in that instance, it would be 4 generations of the family that ran this company. This was designed by S. Edwin Toby, a very well-known architect, and they always had a corner store. This is Dartmouth Street and Huntington Avenue, and eventually we'd see them at Coolidge Corner, Wellesley, Belmont, even in West Hartford, Connecticut. So the whole concept was Boylston Street was really the predecessor to the Avenue of the Arts. It had magnificent buildings, major institutions, but also apartment buildings. And seen here are 2 lions that kept guard to the entrance to the Hotel Kensington. And when the Kensington was built, this was something that actually only had 6 apartments. They were 18 rooms apiece. And this was something that was quite grand. But these lions, which were done by a man named Alexander Pope, were really quite gorgeous. And a poem was written about them. And it said, "Oh, the Kensington Lions on Boylston Street are our most blue-blooded pair. There's a haughty turn to their haughty heads and a cultured curl to their hair. As they gaze on the common folk who pass with a very highbrow stare, oh, the Kensington Lions on Boylston Street, they deserve a place of their own. They ought to be moved out to Beacon Hill, or they ought to be guarding a throne. For the Lowells or the Cabots or the Coolidges, or some of other of Boston's own. The Kensington Lions on Boylston Street, when I meet them face to face, and I bow to them most demurely, in a manner most discreet, for there's many a highbrow dwelling on the wrong side of Newbury Street. These survived until 1967 in front of the Hotel Kensington. I remember them, but they were actually guarding a parking lot when I was a child. But they were saved, and they went to stand in front of the Copley Plaza Hotel. And seen here is Alexander Pope, a very well-known man who painted as well as did etchings and carvings of animals. He was born and raised in Dorchester, later living in Brookline. But as you can see on the left-hand side, the Kensington was quite a magnificent building, new Old South Church in the distance, but you can see them as gilded lions in front of the Copley Plaza. There was also the Horace Mann School for the Deaf, originally on Pemberton Square, which we saw earlier. The school moved to Newbury Street in this building designed by Arthur Vinyl. And you realize that here, deaf children were educated in ways thought revolutionary in the late 19th century, with courses on cooking, woodworking, and printing that allowed them to progress and thereby achieve success. Eventually, the school moved to Roxbury in 1929, and the building was used as Boston University's School of Music until it was demolished in 1963. And you began to see that Boston, which had become a tourist attraction in the latter part of the 19th century, replaced their inns and taverns with luxury hotels. When this was built in South Boston, it was called the Mount Washington Hotel. 100 rooms, every one of which overlooked the ocean. It was only 10 minutes from downtown Boston, and you could take a streetcar for 12.5 cents. Sounded better to buy it round trip. But the building succeeded, and by 1839, it failed. And at that point, it was sold at auction. And a man who bought it without his trustees' permission was a man named Samuel Gridley Howe. Howe had been born in Milton, but as an adult, he specialized in education for the blind. His wife was Julia Ward Howe, who actually wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And he was actually operating a school on Pearl Street in Boston in a row house given to him by Thomas Handelside Perkins, the wealthiest merchant in Boston. But he needed more space. And without his trustees' permission, he bought the old Mount Washington Hotel for $50,000, which would have been the equivalent of about $50 million. At that point, he would either be fired if he didn't raise that $50,000. So he set about it immediately. Within a month, it raised $50 by not only dances for the students, as well as a bake sale. He knew he'd never raise the money. Well, a woman came forward. That was Mrs. Harrison Gray Otis, the widow of the third mayor of Boston. Not only was she grand, she was wealthy. She dressed in Parisian fashions. And she said, "Let me handle it." Well, she rented Quincy a market. Upstairs is Quincy Hall, and of course it has a rotunda, as you all know. Well, she invited everyone in Boston for a dance. It was only $1, very inexpensive, so everyone could come. But she selected 12 of the most beautiful young ladies in Boston to be greeters. And when she arrived with these 12 women in white diaphanous gowns with roses in the hair, everyone oohed and ahed. They came in and they took their places at the pilasters supporting that rotunda. And she created kissing booths. And she would auction these young ladies for a kiss. And at the end of the night, she had raised $50,000. I don't think the poor girls ever had a kiss. But it became the Perkins School for the Blind in South Boston. Later in 1912, it moved to Watertown, where it's still located today, and I volunteer there. They also had the Parker House. Harvey Parker had started a small hotel on School Street, later increased it in size. And seen here, this building dated to 1887. On the left is King's Chapel, on the right, the Tremont Temple. And you realize the Parker House wasn't just a sophisticated luxury hotel, it had one of the better dining rooms. So what's one thing at the Parker House you can think that they served? Exactly, Parker House rolls. And what else? Boston cream pie, the Massachusetts state dessert. Well, this was something that really was fun. And of course, it was a luxury hotel, but it couldn't emulate the Hotel Brunswick. This was at the corner of Boylston and Clarendon Street. It was really one of the premier hotels, not just in Boston, but in New England. Designed by Peabody and Stearns and built in 1873, it was a very popular place. It included the likes of Ulysses Simpson Grant, Prince Alexis of Russia, as well as Queen Lily Lugalani of Hawaii. But it also had rooms that were decorated beyond belief. They had a Venetian room. Every chandelier and wall sconce came from the island of Murano in Venice. They also had an Egyptian room where everything was Neo-Egyptian in design. Well, during this period, this was the height of sophistication. But by the 1920s and early 30s, especially after the Depression, it became a merchant marine hotel. But it was saved by Harvard University. After the war, and we're all far too young to remember, they had the GI loan. It allowed any man or woman who had served in the armed forces to either return to college or to continue their college education. And many of these people were married. Well, the graduate school at Harvard University bought the Hotel Brunswick, and this was where in 3 rooms, because they all had suites, these people would live right up until the period of 1957. I knew some people that actually had lived there, and they said that not only did the $90 that they got monthly pay $70 for their tuition, but the other $20 paid for the month's sojourn with food at the Brunswick. And there was also the Hotel Pelham, and this was the first French flat or apartment hotel to be built in Boston. This is at the corner of Tremont and Boylston Street, facing Boston Common. As a French flat, it meant that you lived on 1 floor rather than having a 5-story row house. And it became very fashionable in Paris, and it became in 1857, this instance, the first in the United States. It was designed by Alfred Stone, a fairly well-known architect, and of course, Joseph Dix, who actually owned not only the Hotel Thorndike, but the Hotel Kensington, had started this. Well, this was something, if you divide it down the center, had 1 apartment on each floor. They not only had an elevator, it had central heating, a private dining room, a private library, a private billiard room, and it was the height of sophistication. Isabella Stewart Gardner lived here for 2 years while her house was built on Beacon Street in the Back Bay, and your servants could actually live in the attic. But this spurred on apartment buildings. Though they weren't called French flats, they too were on an even level of 1 floor. This was the Hotel Warren on Warren Street in Roxbury. It was designed by noted architect Carl Feamer, very well-known man. He started his career with William Ralph Emerson, the father of shingle-style architecture. But this was a multi-unit suburban apartment house. Roxbury was suburban at this period. And it was something that had large elevators, apartments, and a 6-story apartment building that faced Joseph Warren Square. In this instance, the American Architect and Building News said that it was built of red brick and limestone and had string courses around rounded bays, capped with pinnacle roofs and projecting bays. Well, this place would have apartments, 6 rooms, up to 18 rooms. It had its own pharmacy, so you can imagine there were seniors. It had a dining room, a billiard room, and its own post office. And in an advertisement that I've seen in 1897, it was advertised as the perfect place for the newly married and the nearly dead. Entertainment was increasing in Boston. Many people enjoyed theater and movies and all sorts of things. And seen here on Washington Street, on the right-hand side, you can see City Mart, which was the successor to R.H. White, a well-known department store in Boston. But on the left, you see amusement centers, RKO Keith, the Adams House. So there were plays, musicals, and all sorts of different things you could entertain. But entertainment really went the gamut. Some people love baseball, and we have the Red Sox. But do you remember the Boston Braves? Well, this was a well-known baseball park that formerly stood on Commonwealth Avenue between Babcock and Gaffney Streets in Allston. The stadium was designed by Osborne engineers and was home to the Boston Braves National League from 1915 to 1952, America's oldest professional baseball franchise, until the team was sold and moved to Milwaukee. Look at the number of people. Baseball was big business, and the Braves, as you see here in 1952, lamented the fact that they were sold and moved away. But entertainment could also include the Floating Palace Theater. This was a floating building on Marine Park in South Boston. It's said that it has not only a capacity of 1,700 people, it was the coolest spot on earth, but it was something that would have all sorts of plays. And here, for a few cents, you would actually go out and realize that you could actually be quite cool in the summer. Well, in the latter part of the 19th century, Marine Park and Castle Island began to be developed into such a way that attracted people to come out and enjoy the ocean, just like Revere Beach. This was the head house, designed by Wheelwright and Haven, who designed the Opera House. Originally built for the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, this was brought back to Boston and erected at Marine Point. If you look to the left in the distance, you'll see Castle Island. This was a place that had restaurants, ice cream shops, bathing facilities, as well as even facilities for other things too. It had a projecting wharf 200 feet that went into the water where people could dance on Friday and Saturday evenings. It was really quite elegant. It was actually destroyed during the Great Hurricane of 1938, but in 1941, an electrical fire destroyed everything. Within that area, too, was the South Boston Aquarium. Though Boston had aquariums in the 19th century, they were just small rooms with small aquariums. This was an aquarium designed by William Downes Austin and built in 1912. At the same time, he had built the buildings at Franklin Park Zoo. As you can see, this was a great attraction, and it was an elevated railway that would bring people, not the one from Roxbury to Charlestown, but the elevated railway also had streetcars. And for a nickel, you could come out to the head house and then eventually to the aquarium. This was pink stucco with a red tile roof, and when you entered into it, it had over 75 individual tanks of all sorts of marine life, including turtles and seals. Unfortunately, after the Depression, the city of Boston did not reinvest in many of these buildings, not just the aquarium, but Franklin Park Zoo. And by the 1950s, it had fallen on hard times. Robert Lowell, a very well-known poet in mid-century Boston, wrote this poem about it. And he said that the old South Boston Aquarium stands in a Sahara of snow now. Its broken windows are boarded. The bronze weathervane cod has lost half its scales. The airy tanks are dry. Once my hand crawled like a snail on the glass. My hand tingled to burst the bubbles, drifting from the noses of cow-compliant fish. My hand draws back. I often sigh still for the dark, downward and vegetating kingdom of the fish and reptile. The aquarium is gone. Everywhere, giant fin cars nose forward like fish. A savage civility slides by on grease. These were parts of what was Boston. They've been lost, not only by demolition or by repurposing or even by fire, but one of the biggest places was something called Scollay Square. Now, I'm not going to ask for a hand of who remembered Scollay Square or even went there, but Scollay Square, which was named for William Scollay, became a place of entertainment. It not only had movie houses, but it also had burlesque houses. And if you look on the right was the Crawford House. And the Crawford House was the domain, as we see here, of Sally Keith. It was opened in 1867, and we saw it as a place that not only had a dining room called the Crawford Notch Dining Room, but it also had, by the 1920s, a theatrical bar, numerous local dancers, musicians, and comedians, and was to become well known as the home of Sally Keith, a prominent burlesque pioneer and performer in the city. And you can see here, she sang for 40 years. But there was also the Old Howard. And now, when I said to remember that old feather store, do you think this woman bought her feathers at the old feather store? Well, this was the ethereal Sally Rand. Now, this was a pinup. I think it's the most wonderful photograph. She was a well-known performer who began her career as an aerobic dancer at carnivals in the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus. Rand was a graceful and refined burlesque dancer and would play peekaboo with her body by manipulating huge ostrich fans, both in front of her and behind her. Like a winged bird, she would swoop and twirl on the stage as a guard to keep too much of Mother Nature from showing. Well, she couldn't show Mother Nature because she had a body stocking from her neck to her toes, and it was all in the mind. But there was also the Howardettes. And though this is not quite the Vincent Club drill, the Howardettes of the old Howard seem to have it down pat. The Howardettes were a group of chorus dancers, and seen here in sweet but sexy little Bo Peep costumes, with a ruffled collar and an ostrich feathered hat, they would perform a line dance with a high kick to the delight of the audience. They were Boston's answer to the Rockettes of New York. And of course, there was Anne Corio, whose surname was originally Coiro and was changed because her family disapproved of her chosen profession. She was a popular burlesque stripper and actress. Her good looks and shapely figure landed her showgirl roles that led to her becoming a well-known striptease artist. But her popularity as a feature performer on the burlesque circuit began in the old Howard, where she became known as Harvard's baby. Beloved by Harvard students, and the class of 1937 at Harvard even made her an honorary member. She became their mascot. My father, who was the class of 1939, always lamented there was never a mascot for his class. But they also, seen here, had the old Howard, which was once a place of worship that became a temple of worship for the body. It had been built in 1846, designed by Isaiah Rogers for a Seventh-day Adventist church. And when the congregation sold it, it was converted into a place called the Howard Athenaeum. Polite, we would see three-penny operas, musicals, and plays, but by the 1890s was a place that was a veritable temple of burlesque. It would eventually be closed in 1953 when the Boston Vice Squad made a film during one of their raids, capturing the performance of Irma the body. And you can see her on the lower right-hand side. Each of these represent in some ways a whole aspect, but the Howard Athenaeum was designed by Isaiah Rogers and built in 1846 as a Gothic revival theater, which offered a variety of theatricals, three-penny operas, and vaudeville acts that were bawdy with burlesque. By 1893, it was presenting spectacles and dramas and would be renamed the Old Howard. During the Depression years, burlesque was the most popular form of entertainment offered across the country. And seen in a photograph from August 1953, Howard Street, we just saw it, was thronged with men arriving for the performances of Carol Shannon, Betty Biddle, Tony Brennan, Mary Murray, and Dallas. Seen on the lower right-hand side is Gypsy Rose Lee. But a man by the name of Frank Hatch wrote a little ditty after this was closed. And it said that Boston has two Athenaeums, both on Beacon Hill. One is for scholars with books by the score, the other for lads who seek life in the roar. The Boston Athenaeum's lights are bright, but the Howard Athenaeum's locked up tight. Some purist got himself a jurist and slapped a padlock on the door. Some coward closed the old Howard. Well, in that instance, Lost Boston is a book on a variety of themes. And from the 1850s to the present, it really does touch upon everything that our families, our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents would have known. I love doing this book. It was a great example in some ways of how you could make typical things that I knew more accessible to the general public. In some ways, it was not only fun to do, but it was a great memory from the past. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. Does anyone have any questions or comments?
I do.
Please.
Early on, you talked about Boston annexing the neighboring communities.
Yes.
Brookline didn't go. It's surrounded almost completely.
Exactly.
And can you shed a little light on?
Well,
how that
Brookline,
works?
which was called Muddy River, was once part of Boston, but then they became an independent town in 1705. By 1868, when they annexed Roxbury, they continually petitioned the town of Brookline to join Boston. Well, what better thing? Municipal water, streets, sidewalks, parks. Brookline, which was considered the wealthiest town in America, refused. What did they need Boston for? And they retained somewhat of their rural enclave. They refused at a town meeting repeatedly, and eventually Boston gave up. They didn't need Boston, though Boston would have actually had a plum because it would emulate in a suburban fashion the Back Bay. Any other questions or comments, please?
What part of Boston did you grow up in?
I was raised in Copley Square in Dorchester. The Mitchells had a huge house on Melville Avenue, and I guess I would have been the fifth generation to live there. Though I have an Italian surname, my father came from Medford. But the idea was I lived in this house with an extended family. My grandfather, who was born in 1879, if you can imagine, would tell these stories about the family horse, Meg, and all these different things. But they raced in the Dorchester Gentlemen's Driving Club. I was fascinated. My sister could have cared less, but I would sit there mesmerized, listening to the stories. And he would take me in town, and we would actually see many of these things before they were demolished. Yes.
You were growing up, was the Englewood?
Yes, I remember it well. It was opposite Ashmont Station. The Englewood was a diner, which was very unusual. This was at the junction of Ashmont Hill and Ashmont. Very lovely area that today has become exclusive. But the Englewood was something where you could get a cup of coffee or a diner meal. I had never been in there, but I went to school at Roxbury Latin with the young man who worked there in the afternoons. The school was expensive, and I assume his mother was a single mother, but I'd never gone into it. But the Englewood did survive, but I guess it's now moved to Wakefield. Any other questions? Yes.
And Daniel Chester French.
Yes.
Pieces.
Yes.
Were they saved?
They were saved. And if you remember the post office and sub-treasury, there were 17-foot high statues. Well, the city of Boston took them. They placed them on the alley at Franklin Park, and they're still there. They built granite plinth bases, which are about 10 feet high. So they stand 27 feet in height. And, you know, an alley is something that just continues. It's almost a mile in length, but they're there. But also does anybody know the Custom House Tower? When I was a child, that was the tallest building in Boston. But the idea was when they demolished the interior rotunda, they had 12 columns. 8 of those were used as a triumphal arch at Franklin Park Zoo. So a lot of times these things were reused. And though they're no longer there, the idea is the 2 pieces of art. Daniel Chester French was a major, major sculptor. But again, they're outside and they're marble and they efface. So I think sometimes it's always hard because maybe 100 years from now, they may not really survive. Any other questions? Thank you all for coming.